Tom, did I actually say that heaven, that we were talking about heaven?
On Friday night?
Did I say that? I thought I said what happens when we die. Does that say something about our hope? Because what I want to talk about this morning has to do with what happens when we die. Not necessarily heaven. That's a nice thought. That's a wonderful goal to have. But it's not the end of everyone. What happens when we die? Betty, see that name up there? Homer Haley, one of my all-time favorite. It's not up. No, that's because I didn't put it up there, right? Maybe this will work. Maybe. It did. It worked. This is one of my favorite people of all time. I grew up, I had the privilege of sitting in the audience as a teenager with this man preaching. Most of my growing up years, I listened to this man. It was said that he was one of 6 people in the world at the time that could rewrite the Bible from memory. He knew a lot. He knew a lot. So it humbles me and it scares me to death to disagree with him on something. But he talked about and he wrote about Christians didn't have to face judgment when they died. They were past judgment. And I don't think we face judgment as Christians for salvation, because we have that. But I do think there is judgment for Christians, for perhaps placement in eternity. And it all is based on who our Father is and who our people are as to whether we're saved in the first place. And in the scriptures, as we read about what happens when different ones die, there's a lot of controversy about what is talking about the end of the Jewish system or the destruction of Jerusalem, and what's talking about the end of time when the Lord Jesus comes back again for the destruction of all things. So my question and what I want to pursue, and there's going to be a lot of avenues that we will take to try and figure out what the Bible actually teaches about this, because I don't know that we know. It's kind of like what John said in 1 John 3:2. We don't know what we're going to be, but when the Lord comes back and we see Him, then we'll know, because we're going to be like He is. That's pretty much the way most of this is going to wind up being. We're going to have to wait and see. But I think there is evidence that we can follow. I want to ask a question about around us here. Why do you suppose it is that property values are skyrocketing here? Somebody answer that. Why? Why is property going so high?
People want to live here.
Huh?
People want to live here.
Wait a minute. They're living somewhere, right? Why do they want to live here?
It's a desirable place.
It's a desirable place. It's more desirable than the other places. Wherever they are and they don't want to be there anymore, there's a reason why they don't want to be there and they want to be here. So, let's read. In 2 Peter chapter 3, the Apostle Peter's talking about the end of time. And I know it's the end of time because he's describing the destruction of everything that is here now. And he goes on to say, but according to his promises, he's already talked about the melting of the elements with intense heat. And then he says, we're looking for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Ron, buddy, I hurt for you every time you bring that up about. Now, I know what you're getting ready to say about his shirt. I saw you say shirt. You were talking about grabbing him, snatching a knot in that guy's neck. Because that's what we want to do with people who are so evil in the way that they treat others. We're looking for a new heavens and a new earth wherein you don't have to worry about stuff like that. Wherein righteousness dwells. But you know, that's not new, because way back, 2,000 years before the Lord, we have the father of the Hebrew nation. And it's said of him in Hebrews chapter 11, let's read. For he was looking for the city. He was looking for a place, a city. Sandpoint. No. He's looking for a place which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He knew that around people in this world that did not have the proper respect for the Almighty, there wouldn't be righteousness. In 1 Peter chapter 1, here's what Peter says about the hope of this. And he's talking about going back to what Jesus was describing to those people in John chapter 8, about their father and his father. About the difference between the people that have different fathers. We all have the same creation father, but some of us walked away from home. We ran away from home. We ran away from home and we adopted another father. The most embarrassing, heartbreaking moment that I can remember in dealing with my father. And my dad was good about whooping. He could put a whooping on you. But this particular time, he didn't even whoop me. He had given me advice about something. And I went down the street and I talked to my neighbor. A man who had never done a thing for me. Not one thing that this man ever done. And I listened to him rather than my father. When Dad found out, the look on his face just killed me. Because it wasn't anger. It was pure hurt. It was pure misery because his own son did not trust him, but trusted a stranger who lied to him. So here's what Peter writes. If you address as Father, the one who impartially judges according to each one's work. That's a word nobody likes to use. The religious world shies away from that word, but it is throughout the Scriptures. Work. We don't earn our salvation. That is such a gracious gift. Such a gift from God. No matter what we ever did in our lives, we could not make that a profitable thing to God. He says, if you address as Father, the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, here's what you do. He says, conduct yourselves in fear. Now, this is not just trembling. This has to do with awe and admiration. This is what happens when they perform miracles and everybody says, whoa, wow, what? That's what this is. This has an element of fear if you understand the power behind that. It gives you an understanding that you don't mess with that power. You don't. So Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 5. Here's Paul's view. That was Peter. Now here's Paul's view. We're going to stick this in here because here's what Paul says about that. Conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth. Paul says, therefore, Be careful how you walk, not as unwise mankind, persons. Don't walk as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. What in the world can that mean? You ever think, I need to get that done. Yep, sure do. Need to get that done. Yep, I'm going to do that. Yep. Oh, I didn't get that done. What happens there? What happens when we don't respect the passing of time? When we don't pay attention to the fact that we're growing old? I tell you something. I've noticed something about my little boy. That's him, Bubba, by the way. The other one's not a little boy. Well, he's not either, but he's little compared to the other one. I've noticed something. He doesn't get around like he used to. I brought a unicycle home one time. I dropped it off at the house, and I was gone for a day, and I came back, and he was dribbling a basketball down the street on that unicycle. I bet he can't do that no more. He doesn't move like that anymore. I watched him go up a ladder. He doesn't go up a ladder like he used to anymore. When we get old, we're supposed to learn things about us, about the passing of time. We're supposed to learn that there is an ultimate, inevitable end to this form in which we live. He says, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. They slip up on you. They creep up on you. They will be there before you realize it, and you won't have time. So then, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Understand it. Make the time that you have on this earth, spend it in awe and admiration of the power that saved us in the first place. Let's get back to what Peter said. Peter says, conduct yourselves in fear during your time of your stay on earth, knowing that you were not redeemed. That means bought back. That's like you do with a pawn shop when you take something and you get a little bit of money for something that's really expensive. And then you really want it back, so you go and you redeem it. You buy it back plus interest. I lost a watch that way one time. Waited too long, couldn't get it back. Didn't matter much, couldn't wear a watch anyway. It quits when it gets on me. But you don't like to lose things like that. The Lord bought us back from our own mistakes. He says you were redeemed, not redeemed or bought back with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile, worthless, absolutely meaningless, your futile way of life inherited from your forefathers. We're going to talk about somebody here in a minute that was so enamored with life because he was a child of Abraham, which meant absolutely nothing if he wasn't going to be like Abraham. He says, you weren't redeemed with stuff like gold and silver, but with precious blood as of a lamb, unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. For he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but has appeared in these last times for the sake of you, for our sakes, who through him are believers. This word right here, believers, we get the idea, or the religious world has the idea, that this is some mental switch that you throw, and if you throw it and you do, yes, yeah, he is, yeah. That's enough. That is absolutely, totally wrong. It says if you are believers or trusters in God. You trust God? Do you? Do we trust God? How do we show that we trust God? That's not just a mental thing. When you trust something, it means that you act accordingly. I had a truck. But I wasn't about to drive to Florida in that truck. I trusted around here because I can call Jake, he'll come get me. I know he will, he would. But if I'm in Georgia, he ain't going to come get me. I don't trust the truck to take me to Georgia, so I had to buy a car. How we act demonstrates the level of trust that we have in something. Who through Christ, we are trusters in God, who raised Christ from the dead and gave Him glory, so that your faith and your hope are in God. Who's your daddy? Who is your father? Who do we look to as the provider in our life? Do we trust the neighbor who has never done anything for us? Do we trust the devil with his temptations? Or do we trust what God has given us and what God has given us for our own benefit? We're redeemed, bought back by the blood of the Lamb in hope. What is the hope? Peter goes on. He says, since, it's in the past now. This has already been done. Since you have, in obedience to the truth. Obedience, there's an action there, right? When you obey, it's not just a mental switch that you throw, but it's that mental switch that causes you to do something. Obedience to the truth, you purified. Another action. You purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren. We did it for a reason. We did it to accomplish something. He says, because of that, fervently love, another action, one another from the heart. Here's the reason. For you have been born again. That was somebody else's doing. That's God's doing. God did that. You have been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable. That is, through the living and abiding or enduring Word of God. Now let's go to that passage in 1 Peter 2 that Bubba read. Here's what makes us children, family of God. You are a chosen race. How many places in the Bible does it talk about a calling, a choosing? That many are called, but few are chosen. Why is it that there's a calling and there's a choosing? Not everyone who is called is chosen. What is the difference? What is it that makes God choose this one and not that one? Is it something that God did before He ever made the world and is so unfair that He creates somebody just to destroy them? I cannot buy that. I can't even take that for free. That just ain't right. God did not do that. God created us and gave everyone the opportunity. Marty brought out very eloquently in class the reasons that it's not predestined for everybody. You, yes, you know. It has something to do with our calling and our receiving that calling. In John 1, it says of Jesus' word, it says, He came unto His own, and His own did not receive Him. Most people rejected Him. But as many as received Him, to them He gave the right to become children of God. That didn't make them children of God, but it gave them the right to go to the next step and receive that blessing of salvation, being born again, a brand new start. This time to use and to show where we fit in this eternal kingdom of God. He says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. This is what Paul was referring to when he wrote in Ephesians 1, and he says, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened. And he wanted them to be able to understand, be enlightened in three different things. Number one was the hope of his calling. What does that mean? To hope in what God calls us to be. The second thing that he said is to be enlightened in the glory of his inheritance in the saints. I want you to ponder that for a minute, because what that is saying is, what does it mean to be what God inherits out of this whole project of creation? To be the very thing that God made all of this to redeem, to buy back, to have as his own. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to buy a birthday present? That ain't gonna work for God. How do you buy for someone who not only has everything but made everything? How do you buy a present for God? I'll tell you how you give a present to God. Is you be what he created you to be in the first place, and brought you back, cleaned you up, and gave you a chance to be exactly that. A people for God's own possession. If we could just understand the glory that there is in being one of those that God picks out of the fire, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Darkness. Outer darkness. Darkness where there is no truth, where there is no righteousness. I had a thought last night. I don't know why I've never thought of this before. I'm going to have to pursue this to figure out whether it has any validity to it or not. But I read a quote from somebody. I don't know who made the quote. There wasn't a name attached to it. It says, for those who reject God, have no respect for God, eternity is God's gift to them, giving them their wishes. Whew. Think about that for a minute. We choose it. We don't want anything to do with God. Okay. You got it. That's yours. You can have it. Everything that we read about in the Bible is encouraging people to accept God, to trust God, so that he can bless us eternally. Peter says, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out. Do you see the word church there? It's not the word church, but it certainly is the definition of the word church. It's kaleo, to call, and out. Ek. Ek is out. Ekkalesia is the Greek word for church. I don't know how we wound up with a German name for called out. Kirche is the German word for church. How did we get that? I guess because most of the writers of the Renaissance were German. That you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has churched you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For once you were not a people, But now you are. Not just a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, now you have received mercy. Man, I'm out of time. So, how does Luke chapter 16 fit into this? Got two stories here. I'm going to introduce the stories, and I want you to read these two stories, and we'll talk about it next week. But here's what I want us to see. Normally, you read the first one first, because that's the way Luke wrote it. He wrote about the unjust steward, the unrighteous steward, and then we read about Lazarus and the rich man. But I want to read here. Now there was a rich man, and he habitually, what does that mean? Habitually? What's the key word here? What's the root word here? Habit. It was his habit. He rose up in the morning and he spent all day living joyously, in splendor. How'd he get that? We have no idea how he got that, do we? Doesn't say a thing about how he got it. Does it matter how he got it? He has it, right? However he got this, he has it. He has this, and other people have other things. What is he responsible for in his life? What he has. You apply this to the first story, that is the unjust steward, and put them together so that one explains the other. I love this about this chapter in Luke, because one is saying the same thing as the other, only different. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? They're talking about the same thing. Apply the previous story to the steward, and you see that this guy, this rich man, is squandering his master's possessions, and he's abusing his stewardship. Because everything, remember what Paul said? Live your lives. Be careful how you walk. Not as unwise men, but as wise. Make the most of your time. Not just your time, but what you have as well. Because the time's evil. Days are evil. They're going to slip up on you. Now the first story, I want to set this and then we'll quit this morning. First story is about this steward who has the responsibility of caring for his master's goods. He's a store manager or something. I don't know what he is. But he's got the control of everything. Just like the rich man did. He had control of everything that he owned. The unrighteous steward was squandering his master's possessions. He was embezzling. He was spending it on himself. He was living off of the store. Instead of selling it, he was using it. Master found out. And the master told him, I'm taking that away from you. I need you. You're going to get audited. Bring me the books. We're going to look at what you did. From that moment on, he knows there's an end. The rich man? We'll stop there. What was different about the rich man and the unjust steward? You got two different stories, but they're all talking about the same thing. I want us to understand how these parables have a principle, a moral to the story. If you start taking every element of these parables or these stories and you try to make it mean something, there's an old adage that says that which proves too much proves nothing at all. You ever heard that? That's really true about parables and about stories that Jesus uses to prove something. Like the pearl of great price. You start proving too much by that, there's a point to that, and that is that there's something of value that you would trade everything that you have to get. Go too far beyond that, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Because not everything in those stories has some kind of an inner meaning. There's a moral to them. I want us to understand the moral of these two stories about what happens when you die. So please, read Luke chapter 16 for next week, because we're going to deal with that. The lesson is yours, folks. Right on time. Right on time. I still think maybe you should have snatched a knot in his neck. I'm just kidding, folks. Just kidding. That sure is what you want to do. It's why we're looking for this new heaven and new earth wherein righteousness dwells, where we don't have to worry about the righteousness of others. We're with our people, with our Father. The lesson is yours, folks. If you're subject, you need the gospel. You need to obey the gospel. If your life's not right, make it right today while we stand and sing.